Hi everyone, welcome back to 1SA, First Sight Analysis, today with a piece that I was reminded of when we were looking into Mozart's Dissonant Quartet. So if you didn't see that video, what we found was that the quartet, even though it sounds so harsh and dissonant and seemingly atonal, is actually built on a fairly standard and straightforward harmonic structure. And as I remember, the piece today, which is Chopin's Prelude in A minor, is similar in that respect. So it's also a piece that sounds really unclear and harsh and obscure and seemingly random. Also pretty harsh and pretty unclear. It seems to meander through different things without establishing any particular harmony or key. There's the C sharp clashing directly with the C double sharp. And later on there's even a C natural. So all kinds of C's, and then there's D sharp and so on. So very complicated to the ear in general. So why don't we start right there and try to see what's going on. So that C sharp moves into a C natural. It's like the voice that was carrying the C sharp moved down to the C natural in that same voice. And then I also see that same change, C sharp going to C natural down here. And by the way, that double accidental there, that natural followed by the sharp, that's just, don't get confused by that. Back in those days, they were very explicit and meticulous. And since the C in that same octave was double sharp, then before making it sharp, they used to cancel it with the natural sign. But that's just a notation thing. This is a C sharp. And the point is that that C sharp is then moving to the C natural just as the other voice also moves. So it's like this last note of the pattern is actually just doubling the top voice of the pattern. And if you look at the rest of the prelude, that happens throughout the whole thing. That same doubling, the last note doubles the top note all through the piece. That's an interesting thing to note. And if we were to make a scheme of this figuration, it's kind of a schematic map of what the pattern is, then those three notes are basically doubling of the same voice. What else do we find in the pattern? Any note that's in the bass is part of a harmony. It kind of defines a harmony. So the note in the bass is going to be part of a chord. So we now have two of the notes of each beat. What are we missing? Well, there's also the three other notes. Clearly the middle note is just a neighbor tone that's kind of ornamenting the two outer notes. And that would account for all the notes in the pattern that would then turn out to be just a figuration of these three notes. That seems to be how the prelude works as a whole. So if we apply the pattern to the very first chord, we have these three notes, E, G, and B. That's straightforward the chord of E minor. And that repeats one more time, another time, and so on for three measures. And even notes in the melody are part of that chord of E minor, so this is working fine. Then on measure 4, we have D, G, B. That's the chord of G major with the bass on D, meaning that's second inversion. We note that as G6-4. The next chord it's a chord of D where the G was suspended from the chord before, but it will move down to an F sharp on the next chord, which is actually the full chord of D major, D, F sharp, A. Moving on to the next line, here the pattern actually changes. For a couple of measures we don't have the pattern anymore, but we have this G in the bass, there's B in the melody, there's another G down there, and then an oscillation between E, D, and E flat. That works just as a prolongation of a D, with its neighbors on E and E flat, but always going back to D. So the chord is G, B, and D. That's G major, which lasts for two measures. And then after that, we have the return of a pattern. So since the pattern seems to be working fine, what I'll do is I'll just go on autopilot and read the rest of the chords according to that pattern. And I'll speed that up, and in the background I'll play the music from the prelude, but it's not intended to sync up or anything. So here we go. Okay, a couple of additions and details here and there and small deviations from the general pattern, but the pattern did give us the key to what the chords in the piece are. And now we have this series of chords, and what we need to do now is interpret that series of chords in terms of what the progression is. Very good place to start is this G6-4 chord, because that kicks off a very common cadential formula and really establishes that last chord, the G chord, as a key. So very clearly we're in G, and at this point, how far back can we interpret things as being in G? The chord before it is the chord of E minor, which in G would be 6. Since this is the very first chord, the ear won't understand that as 6. It will understand it as a 1. 1 in E minor, which is a pivot, as 6 in G, which is where the progression continues. Okay, the next chord is B minor. This is where the texture goes back to the original pattern. And if you look ahead one chord, then there's that D6-4 chord going to a suspended dominant chord. In fact, the whole phrase is just a transposition of the first phrase, in this case, in B minor becoming D major. Now this time that 5 will not resolve to 1. It's not going to D major, which would have been 1, but it goes to a half diminished chord of D sharp. So what do we do with that? The half diminished chord, one of the places it arises in a scale, is as 7. So if D sharp is 7, then 1 would be E. In the scale of E, D sharp is 7, let me bring it back behind the E, and the chord of this D sharp would be the half diminished chord we're looking for. Now this same scale could be the scale of C sharp minor, and if you center the scale on C sharp, then you have the same chord, but this time as a chord of 2. So those are the two options for a D sharp half diminished chord. Which of the two is the one here? There's no elements to tell yet, so let's open both possibilities and see what happens after. What happens after is that the half diminished becomes a fully diminished chord. This is that move between the C sharp and the C natural that we started the whole thing with. And it makes the D sharp chord into a fully diminished chord. And that same chord will just then appear in first inversion, that's the 6-5 there. But it still doesn't help us decide between E major or C sharp minor. The next chord, however, will help us settle. The key factor is that F natural there, which is just one semitone above the E, and then it has a tendency to go to that E. But in that same chord we also have a semitone below the D, that's the D sharp, and that has a tendency to go up towards the E. So it's one of the augmented sixth chords that have this double emphasis to a note. In this case it's the French version of it, but the point is that it emphasizes the E as the dominant, and if E is dominant then our key is A. That settles our decision, we're in A. After the French chord there is the A6-4, that's 1-6-4, and then looking back, let's see how far back we can bring the A. So it's certainly not C sharp. And this chords of 7 in E, well, E is 5 of A, of our new key, so all these chords are 7 of 5. That's what they would be in A minor. Do we have a pivot chord? So the chord before this one is a chord of A itself. So this can be our pivot. What was a 5 in D is a new 1, and then we have this progression in A. And here we are. This is the A minor prelude. We're home. Chopin will leave the melody for a little bit by itself. That melody adds extra notes to the harmony and so on, but harmonically what's going on is that 1-6-4 that we reached is announcing the dominant that eventually comes as 5, that gets ornamented once more with the 5-5, going back to that 5, acquiring the 7th, and eventually resolving to the tonic of A minor. So, as promised, this is a fairly clear and standard harmonic progression for how weird and crazy and not standard the piece sounds on the surface. Do listen to the original. I'll leave you with a recording of this harmonic skeleton that we just extracted. But feel free to leave your comments if you have any questions or thoughts or requests for other pieces. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.